The federal government was amidst one of the most charged debates in American history, which led to Congress preparing the Civil Rights Act. The United States Department of Labor details that in the 1960s, Americans who knew only the potential of equal protection of the laws debated a fundamental constitutional question. Does the Constitution's prohibition of denying equal protection always ban the use of racial, ethnic, or gender criteria in an attempt to bring social justice and social benefits? That debate made its way into the schools, businesses, and everyday life experiences of cities across America. While every American would feel the impact of this landmark shift in American culture and morality, some cities found inescapable notoriety for how the contrasting views were handled. Both activists promoting integration and those clinging to segregationist policies had widespread tactics for promoting and ensuring their views be brought to the forefront. In many cases, violent conflicts took place, most often one-sided against those pursuing change in America. Cities such as Topeka, Kansas, Memphis, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Selma, and Birmingham, Alabama, and even the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., are discussed vividly as key to the spread of the civil rights movement. Lesser discussed, but central to the passing of the Benchmark Act of 1964, is St. Augustine, Florida, just in time for the quadricentennial celebration. The lead up to the congressional vote is often passed over, but it created an environment where a movement could thrive. St. Augustine gained the nickname Florida's Birmingham and became the setting for the final push for the vote, which would disable the legality of public discrimination in America. Prior to the more publicized actions of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the city's movement was under the leadership of Dr. Robert B. Hayling. The King Institute at Stanford University details that the son of a college professor, Hayling grew up in Tallahassee, Florida. He graduated from Florida A&M University with a Bachelor of Science in 1951 and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Air Force before being trained as a dentist in Meharry Medical School in Nashville, Tennessee. In 1960, Dr. Hayling set up his dental practice in St. Augustine. In an interview carried out by Andrew Young, Hayling was asked why he would get involved, and he responded, "I haven't really given that a lot of serious thought. Those things happened so incrementally that I was in a severe fight, before I realized. St. Augustine had been good to me." But he continues that all of a sudden he was in, quote, a situation that challenged my citizenship, my rights, my privileges, and everything as a bona fide citizen. A year before the summer protest, Hayling became an advisor to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Youth Council and began training up the city's youth to protest on behalf of the civil rights. A transcripted interview by David Colburn with Henry Twine, a leader of the St. Augustine civil rights movement, described that, quote, a lot of people claimed that Martin Luther King came and started it, but we were actually doing it approximately a year before King arrived on the scene. After then, the NAACP sent some workers in from around Savannah. They came in and worked during that summer, and we began to make demands on the city, and these were the first marches we had. When asked about race relations prior to the protests, Twine said, well, as usual, we thought things were good. The whites, as usual, thought things were good. And this was before we made any demands. When demands for integration began is when they began to suffer. This sentiment was echoed by Herbert E. Wolf, a leading businessman in St. Augustine, Florida. When interviewed for a documentary made by WCKT Miami, Outlook St. Augustine, Fountain of Dissent, Wolf says, I've been here for more than 46 years, and to my knowledge, the relations between the colored people and the white people have been very excellent, and they will continue to be that way if we are let alone. Our public facilities here, including the schools, have been desegregated, and the only segregation we have here is by private individual places and private enterprise, all of which I believe is legal and should not be disturbed. I think that every one of us expects to respect the law. I do, and I will lend my efforts to that extent. Wolf was incorrect in his statement regarding education in the city and the surrounding county. The Florida State Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights published findings in a report explaining that St. Johns County still did not meet federal standards to be removed from court supervision and reach unitary status, which means They meet all federal integration standards. As of 2005, the district is still under a desegregation order and has never sought unitary status. In a letter written by Joseph G. Joyner, the superintendent of St. John's Public Schools in 2005, to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Joyner explained it would take too much time and money to complete court proceedings to reach unitary status. It was not until a decade later that the St. Johns County School District petitioned the United States District Court for partial unitary status. This is evidence of Herbert Wolf's lack of understanding of the racial disparities in the city's education system and the widespread thoughts that St. Augustine was not struggling with racial discrimination. That discrimination would be felt in a small area of St. Augustine known as Lincolnville, more than anywhere else throughout the next few years. A historical marker in the area details how Lincolnville Historic District was once the site of Indian villages, colonial plantations, and orange groves. Lincolnville began as a settlement of emancipated slaves in 1866. African Americans who traced their origins to the city's 16th century founding played an integral role in the history of St. Augustine for centuries before the forced segregation of the late 1800s led them to create their own community institutions. The lie of integration in the school system was clear. Only 6 Black children had been admitted to white schools, and the homes of 2 of the families of these children had been burned by local segregationists. And other families had been forced to move out of the county because the parents had been fired from their jobs and could find no work. The historically Black Excelsior School is in the Lincolnville neighborhood, which sits adjacent to downtown St. Augustine. It was not until 1968 that the school would close to students as they integrated into other local schools, and at that point became repurposed for local government offices. The building that once housed the city's African American population for high school is now the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center, a public museum covering 450 plus years of African American history in St. Augustine, Florida. The tensions ignored by the citizens of St. Augustine in the early 1960s, forced through to the surface by Halen's youth protesters. Woolworth's department stores became the kickstarter of the high-intensity movement. The Flagler College newspaper explains that the stores were infamous during the civil rights movement for their lunch counter sit-ins, started by college students in Greensboro. Students decided to participate in a sit-in at the Woolworth and were denied hamburgers directly from the whites-only lunch counter, whereas Blacks would order at the counter or around back at the side kitchen door and pick up their orders there. In July 1963, 16 youth activists participated in the sit-in at Woolworth's, and after being arrested, were each facing 6 months in jail. In order to be released from jail, the judge required the students to cease participation in any further protests related to the civil rights movement until they were 21. All but 4 agreed. Audrey Nell Edwards, Joanne Anderson Ulmer, Willie Carl Singleton, and Samuel White eventually became known as the St. Augustine Four. The arrest and the holding of the St. Augustine Four led to a series of protests in St. Augustine in front of Woolworths and extended to other businesses. The FBI published a series of reports discussing the events in St. Augustine. On June 26, 1963, the FBI SAC in Jacksonville submitted an airmail report covering what they deemed a racial situation in the city, mentioning that the Bureau would be advised of pertinent developments. This report discussed the lunch counter at Woolworths and that all occupied seats were taken up, which led to the manager or the McCrory's closing the entire store, but everyone left without incident. Additional reports spoke towards protests that were largely ignored by the public and detailed a drive-by shooting of Dr. Robert Haling's house. The report states that the doctor called the FBI to advise that birdshot had been fired on persons standing in his carport around midnight. The FBI noted that the deputy sheriff apprehended 4 white youths in a white 1950s Ford and in his automobile located a sawed-off 20-gauge shotgun. It wouldn't be long before this was a common occurrence in the city, where leaders, both from the area and those who traveled to be there, would shift between houses to protect themselves from drive-by shootings. Locals who allowed leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. to stay with them are still honored with historical plaques out front of their homes. It was the spring of 1964, and the temperature was rising in St. Augustine, Florida, as the Civil Rights Bill sat with the Senate pending a vote. The Civil Rights Movement Archive explains that the House of Representatives had passed the Civil Rights Bill on February 10, 1964, and a majority of senators had declared they would vote in favor. a group of senators from southern states began to filibuster, a non-stop speech preventing any action on any bill from taking place. Senate rules require two-thirds vote to halt a filibuster. There were not enough senators willing to do so. Teams of senators had kept the speech going for weeks. That was until St. Augustine protests began to gain attention. The clash between civil rights activists and local segregationists, including members of the Ku Klux Klan, made national news and international headlines. The movement's timeline shows how quickly the shift happened. In February, Dr. Haling's home was fired at again, this time almost missing his wife, who was pregnant at the time. The buckshot killed their dog. 3 days later, Haling spoke with the governor's office about the need to protect Black citizens in the city. It was on March 6, 1964, that Haling and other St. Augustine leaders requested the help of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That same month, the movement began to mobilize in the city from northern colleges and abroad. On June 5, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. announces that he will be bringing people to St. Augustine to help with the demonstrations. He called this a, quote, nonviolent army. 2 days later, the house he was staying in was peppered with bullets, and only 4 days later, King was arrested outside the Monson Motor Lodge restaurant, standing on the steps. 200 supporters of segregation, many of which were members of the Ku Klux Klan, marched through Lincolnville, while Black members of the community are said to have laughed and sang, "We love everybody." Next came the moment that shocked the world. Mimi Jones and several other young people chose to swim in the pool at the Monson Motor Lodge for what effectively became known as the swim-in. The archive details that 2 whites and 7 Negroes integrated the Monson Motor Lodge pool. An off-duty police officer, Henry Billets, jumped into the pool to get the demonstrators out and was photographed. James Jimmy Brock became infamous as a villain when he poured muriatic acid into the pool. The photo became an iconic symbol of the anger and violence segregationists were willing to utilize to prove their point. Shortly after, the Senate voted. The Civil Rights Act was passed, and Lyndon B. Johnson signed it into law. The Civil Rights Act would be tested by protesters in St. Augustine and across the country. It would struggle with the application of Jim Crow laws, the idea of separate but equal, held back the full integration of society even further. Yet the country was headed in a new direction. It seems only right that the nation's first city would be the location that projected the nation into a new era.